Okay. So, dear friends and colleagues, I'm happy to welcome Professor Tomas Fukс, who friendly accepted to give us a talk within our series of lectures on the topic, what is phenomenology. Tomas Fukс is Karl Jaspers Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry at Heidelberg University, Germany, and his main areas of research include phenomenological philosophy and psychopathology, as well as embodied and enactive cognitive science. He has authored over 300, I think more, journal articles, book chapters, and several books. And I would like to mention some of them. So the last, In Defense of the Human Being, Foundational Questions of an Embodied Anthropology, Ecology of the Brain, the Phenomenology of and Biology of the Embodied Mind, Imagination and Social Perspectives, Approaches from Phenomenology and Psychopathology, Embodied Perspectives in the Psychotherapy, and the book of 2019, Selbst und Selbststörungen. So it is only some of these books and articles written by Thomas. So I don't want to take up much time. So now I'm happy to give the word to Professor Fuchs, but only one moment. Unfortunately, we are not able to pay for the Zoom, Thomas, because MasterCards and Visa cards are blocked in Russia.
I know.
So after 50 minutes, we needed to reconnect again using the same link.
Okay.
So sorry for this inconvenience, but so the situation now is
no problem. No problem. I know the situation is difficult. Thank you very much, Natalia, for this introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to give this lecture. In maybe I should say at least a few words about these unusual times that we meet. It's certainly not quite usual to be in connection with Russian scientists and researchers and students at the moment, but it's all the more important, I think. And I just wanted to mention that we were well aware of the open letter that was written by 350 Russian scientists, in particular of the Russian Academy of Scientists, at the beginning of the war. On 25th of February, and I think it's now already signed by several thousand other scientists, and I think that's a very important, a very important sign for us in the West or in Germany, that of course not all Russians support this situation or this war. So I think that is very important to know. I just wanted to mention that it's well received, or it's well observed here. Okay, so that's just a few words in advance. Now I start my talk, and no, the sharing the screen is still deactivated, so it should be. You should deactivate should activate the screen sharing.
Yeah, it should be activated now.
Now it should work. Okay, yes. Now the title of my talk is The Significance of Phenomenology Today, and just a moment, I try and something doesn't work here. Doesn't seem possible to use the whole screen for some reasons. I don't know. Let me see. Ansicht, Animation. I tried once more, just a moment. Oh, now it works. Okay. I think you should see the whole screen now. If not, okay. Does it work? Okay,
yeah,
fine.
It's works.
Yeah, fine. Well, phenomenology may be considered the systematic science of subjective experience and its basic structures, such as intentionality, embodiment, temporality, intersubjectivity. And in this way, it has also the crucial task of defending subjective experience against reductionist claims, which are raised in particular from proponents of reductionist naturalism or physicalism. If we take a closer look, for example, at cognitive neuroscience, we find that it is still based on a principal dualism between the mental and the physical, the subjective mind and the objective body. And as a consequence of this divide, mind and world are separated. And what is lost in this principal divide between mind and body is the unity of the human person, which essentially means an embodied subject. The person is neither pure subjectivity experienced from within, nor a complex physiological system observed from without. It is primarily a living being interacting with others. And here, the other is not a hidden mind to be located somewhere behind the other's forehead in the inside. Rather, we experience the other as a living bodily being, visible and expressing himself through his body. That means we perceive the other as a unity of interiority and exteriority. Now, the currently still dominating view of the mind is a disembodied point of view. It sees the mind as a representational model of the world, and this is perhaps best captured by a quotation from the German neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger. He writes in his book, The Ego Tunnel, "First, our brains generate a world simulation so perfect that we do not recognize it as an image in our minds. Then they generate an inner image of ourselves as a whole. And so we are not in direct contact with outside reality or with ourselves. We live our conscious lives in the ego tunnel." That's the title of his book, as I said. And in this view, subjective experience could also be produced by a disembodied brain in a vat that is adequately stimulated. For the mind is only a virtual model of the world. Accordingly, Metzinger considers phenomenology to be a discredited research program, intellectually bankrupt for at least 50 years. Of course, if our subjective experience of being in the world is nothing but an illusion, a biologically produced virtual matrix, as it were, then every attempt to take this experience serious and to explore it in depth, as phenomenology does, is doomed to be pointless from the outset. In this view, we are not in the world, nor in contact with it, for in reality, this world is nothing but clouds of dead particles and streams of anonymous physical energy. Now, this mainstream physicalist view of the world and of ourselves is currently put under increasing pressure. In philosophy of mind, all attempts to solve the hard problem of consciousness have failed. The irreducibility of consciousness stands more firm than ever, challenging the assumption that the physical sciences are able to provide the ultimate explanation of the world. Second, in cognitive neuroscience, the new paradigm of embodied and inactive cognition has gained increasing influence over the last 2 decades. It regards consciousness as embodied, embedded, and enacted through the ongoing interaction of an organism with its environment. And finally, in developmental and social psychology, the dominant view of social cognition as being based on a theory of others' hidden minds is challenged by concepts of embodied intersubjectivity, where we experience the emotion of others in the flesh, so to speak. Now, at this turning point of paradigms, phenomenology plays a crucial role. For the concept of embodiment implies the convergence of two complementary aspects. On the one hand, the phenomenology of the lived or subjective body, which mediates our relation to the world, in German, the Leib. And on the other hand, the dynamic interaction or the ecology of the living, moving, and sensing organism interacting with its environment, as it is conceived by enactivism and dynamic systems theory. So this view on the organism is also a view on the Körper in German. And this means that there is a correspondence between the phenomenology of our bodily being in the world and the ecology of the living organism in its environment. Our embodied existence has a double aspect, both as the body that we are, that we live without noticing, and the body that we have, that we become aware of as an object, as an instrument. And an ongoing oscillation between these two modes or aspects constitutes a fluid foundation of all experiencing. And thus the body itself is the turning point between the interiority and exteriority, between subjectivity and objectivity, between unconscious functioning and conscious attention, or in other words, between processes of living, leben, and processes of living through, of experiencing, erleben. And the fundamental unity which underlies both aspects is nothing else but the process of life itself. Now, on this background, the significance of phenomenology today lies not only in being a mere science of consciousness, rather it is the phenomenology of the pre-reflective, tacitly lived body, which comes nearest to the processes of life. And it is precisely as a science of embodied subjectivity that phenomenology is able to enter into a productive dialogue with the empirical sciences. So in what follows, I will try to demonstrate the significance of phenomenology in three domains: in cognitive neuroscience, in social cognition, and finally in psychiatry. A closer look at these domains will show that phenomenology is by no means a misguided or even bankrupt undertaking, as Metzinger says. Quite on the contrary, it plays a leading role in the paradigm shift that we are witnessing today in different areas of science. Let me start with a look at present cognitive neuroscience. It can easily be seen that it is based on the assumption of a profound difference between mind and life. Or in other words, it lacks a notion of the living organism. Thus, the mind is conceived as purely internal and life as purely external. And the body is conceived as a mere input-output device, not constitutive for the mind. And thus the basis of the mind shrinks to the brain. Disconnected from the living organism and of the process of life, mental and neuronal processes can only be directly related to each other, leading to a short circuit of mind and brain. However, the brain is primarily an organ of the living being, and only through this it becomes an organ of the mind. because both life and mind are essentially related to what is beyond them, depending on the continuous exchange with the environment. So just as respiration cannot be restricted to the lungs, but only functions in a systemic unity with the environment, so the mind cannot be restricted to the brain. Conscious experience is not an internal mental space or a tunnel that could be localized somewhere within the organism, but it is a manifestation of the life process of the organism as a whole, including the ongoing relations between organism and environment, of course. There are two dimensions of this process that underlie the emergence of conscious awareness. On the one hand, cycles of organismic self-regulation, which form the basis of a primary bodily self-awareness, and on the other hand, cycles of sensory-motor coupling between organism and environment. Let us look at these two cycles more closely. First, our experience of being in the world is based on the spatiality of the subjective body. That means subjectivity is extended and more or less coextensive with the organic body. Neuroscientists, as well as philosophers of mind, usually regard this spatial self-experience as an illusion, a projection created in the brain. And this would mean that we are not really inhabiting our bodies. However, it can be demonstrated that the coextension of lived and living body is not just an illusion. And one way to show this is based on the feeling of being alive. This basic feeling of being alive is bound to the body as lived in the background, as a domain of diffuse feelings of ease or unease, of relaxation and tension, of freshness and vigor, or tiredness and exhaustion. This background feeling of the body implies a basic self-affection, which lends a sense of mindness to all our experiences. And it is certainly spatially extended, as you feel yourself sitting at your desk right now, although this spatial feeling is not precisely circumscribed. Its basis is the organism as a whole, namely the continuous circular interaction of brain and body as it is depicted on the scheme and in my scheme on the slide. According to affective neuroscientists, for example, Antonio Damasio or Jacques Panksepp, multiple interoceptive and proprioceptive signals from the body are constantly processed by centers in the brainstem, insular and parietal cortex, and they are integrated into a unified bodily self-awareness. This processing includes the whole present state of the inner milieu, the viscera, the muscular system, including the heart, the vessels, the skin and vestibular system. Brain and body influence each other in constant circular feedback, serving as the basis for an elementary feeling of life itself. And this somatic background feeling never subsides, though we sometimes rarely notice it, because it doesn't represent a particular part of the body, but the overarching state of all domains. And thus every conscious state is ultimately rooted in the homeodynamic interactions of brain and body, and in a sense integrates the present state of the organism as a whole. So processes of life and processes of experience are inseparably bound to each other. Of course, embodied subjectivity doesn't stop at the boundaries of the skin. Our being in the world is mediated by the habitual functioning of the lived body. It operates in every interaction with the world in a tacit mode, without requiring explicit attention. And this is mirrored on the biological level by the complementary coupling of organism and environment, in particular by action-perception loops, by the sensory-motor cycle. In the interaction with objects or situations, the body's sensory and motor organs are linked through the mediation of the central nervous system in order to enable the achievement in question. The sensory-motor feedback cycles are a major component of embodied and inactive cognitive neuroscience. The sensory-motor feedback cycles are a major component of inactive cognitive science. What the organism senses is a function of how it moves, and how it moves is a function of what it senses. This means that living beings do not passively receive information from their environment. Rather, they participate actively in the generation of perception and cognition. So, for example, our gaze scans the surroundings, and this is the basis of our visual perception. In touch, the interdependence of perception and movement is even more obvious. The touching hand is guided by the shape of the object, while conversely, these shapes are disclosed through the hand's movement. Moreover, objects are always perceived as enabling possible actions. To use Heidegger's terms, they are perceived as objects ready to hand. So an object such as a knife can only be perceived by an embodied agent who is capable of somehow interacting with it. For example, having suitable limbs to walk towards the knife, to grasp it, etc. The embodiment of the subject leads phenomenology to the same consequence as the paradigm of embodied cognition. They both reject the representationalist concepts that prevail in mainstream cognitive science. These concepts are based on a principal divide of organism and environment, which means that perception does not connect us to the world, but only with internal representations, inner constructs, or inner models. However, as Merleau-Ponty already emphasized, the phenomenal field is not an inner world. The phenomenon is not a state of consciousness or a mental fact, and the experience of phenomena is not an act of introspection. The same criticism is raised by the inactive approach first put forward by Varela and Thompson. A cognitive being's world is not a pre-given external domain that is represented internally by the brain, but it is a relational domain that is created by the living being's agency and coupling with the environment. In other words, living beings enact their world as inseparable from their own structure and actions. So instead of representations, embodied approaches rely on flexible schemes of interaction with the environment, which are based on brain networks, but are only realized through circular feedback loops. And in these interactions, the brain functions as a mediating organ, not as the sole producer of perception. And thus, the carrier processes that are necessary for conscious experience constantly cross the borders of the skull and the skin. Consciousness may not be localized in any one place at all, but it is based on the ongoing interactions between brain, body, and environment. And this embodied account applies for motor action as well. My actions are not external movements that are triggered by an inner mind, but they are enacted by me as an embodied subject. So when I'm writing a letter, for example, there is no point in the unity of this action where myself ends and the outer world begins. There is no border that separates inner and outer. So I'm not a pure consciousness outside of my own writing, but I'm an embodied, an ecological self whose borders do not stop at the skin. As living bodies, we are extended into the world, always to the point where the current interaction with the world is going on. To summarize, from an embodied approach, the phenomenology of modeling the world corresponds to the ecology of the organism in its environment. They are both complementary aspects of the same life process that connects the subject and the world, or that connects brain, body, and environment. Again, processes of living and processes of experiencing are intimately connected. Now, my second example, social cognition. As we have seen, phenomenology favors embodied and inactive concepts of cognition. And this also applies for the concepts of cognition in the social sphere, which are regarded as embodied intersubjectivity. The currently predominant theories of social cognition are still mainly based on a disembodied view. Concepts such as theory of mind, simulation, mind reading, etc., all assume a fundamental inaccessibility of the other, whose hidden mental states, intentions, or feelings may only be inferred from his external behavior by using some sort of mind reading. And in this way, social understanding becomes a kind of projection of inner models onto others. Moreover, these theories usually are directed towards situations of detached observation instead of face-to-face interactions. However, in most everyday interactions with others, we do not use any introspective simulation or inference. Instead, we immediately perceive the other's intentions and emotions in his expressive behavior. As Sheila already argued, we are directly acquainted with the other's shame in his blushing, with the other person's joy in his laughter, or with his sorrow and pain in his tears. And in this way, the other's body is not just a tool for conveying signs of hidden intentions or emotions, rather it is itself intentional and expressive. The crucial term here is expression, which may be considered a paradigm case of embodiment. The bodily expression of an emotion is not just an external accompaniment that could be separated from an inner feeling, because emotion precisely means outward movement, e movere in Latin. And there is no relation here between an inner and an outer, a significant and a signifier, as if the expression were just a sign for the emotion that we would have to decode. Rather, the sorrow is in its facial expression, or in the crying. The joy is in the smile, and the shame is in the burning cheeks. In this sense, expression is the primordial phenomenon, from the Greek phainomai, that means what shows itself and what is present in this very showing. That with what is expressed manifests itself. It doesn't remain behind. And there is no distinction between internal or external. And even if we suppress the expression of an emotion completely, it still remains a movement tendency that we feel in our own body. Expression thus becomes the core phenomenon of what Merleau-Ponty has termed intercorporeality. In every face-to-face encounter, our body is affected by the other's expression and vice versa. This creates a dynamic interplay which forms the basis of primary empathy, and which I describe as mutual incorporation. It may be described by the following schema. Let us assume that person A on the left side is a person whose emotion, for example, anger, manifests itself in typical bodily changes, facial, gestural, interoceptive changes. So the body functions as a resonance board for the emotion. Person A feels the anger as the tension in his face, as the sharpness of his voice, as the arousal in his body, the impulse to move forward, etc. Now, this is the bodily resonance of his emotion. This resonance is also an expression of the emotion of the emotion at the same time. That means the anger becomes visible as such for A's partner B on the right side. The expression will produce an impression in B, triggering complementary or corresponding bodily feelings. So B not only sees the emotion in A's face, but also senses it with his own body through his own bodily resonance. However, it doesn't stay like this, because the impression and bodily reaction which is caused in B in turn becomes an expression for A. So we move again to the left side. However, slightly, it will create an impression in A again and will change his behavior somehow. For example, withdrawing a little bit or even increasing his anger. And this creates a circular interplay of expressions and reactions which runs in split seconds and constantly modifies both partners' bodily states. They have become parts of a dynamic sensory-motor interaffective system. Each lived body reaches out, so to speak, to be complemented by the other. They are both coupled to form an extended body through interbodily resonance or intercorporeality. No mental representation is necessary for this process. There is no strict separation between the inner and the outer, as if a hidden mental state in the one person produced external signs which the other person would have to decipher. Because A's anger may not be separated from its bodily expression. And similarly, person B doesn't perceive person A's body as a mere object, but as a living, expressive body. So in this sense, we can refer to the experience of the other as an embodied perception, which means an embodied communication as well, or in Merleau-Ponty's account, the communication or comprehension of gestures comes about through the reciprocity of my intentions and the gestures of others, of my gestures and the intentions that are discernible in the conduct of other people. It is as if the other's body it is as if the other person's intentions inhabited my body and my intentions his body. So as we can see, the concept of mutual intercorporeality leads to the opposite of a representationalist account. Primary social understanding is not an inner modeling in a detached observer, but the other's body extends onto my own, and my own extends onto the other. The third and final field I want to consider is phenomenological psychopathology. And here we are confronted with the prevailing biological paradigm in psychiatry, according to which mental illnesses are diseases or malfunctions of the individual brain. But mental illness is not something that goes on within an inner space, neither in the mind nor in the brain. Phenomenological psychiatry has elaborated in many analyses how mental illness manifests itself in alterations of the patient's lived body, lived space, temporality, intersubjectivity, and thus in the whole of the patient's being in the world. The patient is ill, that means his world is ill, as the psychiatrist Jan van den Berg once put it. And in this sense, the illness is not in the patient. Rather, the patient is in the illness, even though its somatic components are localizable within the boundaries of the organic body. From this point of view, mental disorders are always ecological disturbances in the patient's lived body, lived space, and relationship with others. This may be called an extended view of mental illness, and the concept of embodiment serves as a basis for this view. And it is precisely the rather tacit dimension, the implicit way in which our body functions, that is alienated and altered in major psychiatric disorders. I will give just one example for this, namely the concept of schizophrenia as a disembodiment. Current dominant theories, cognitive theories of schizophrenia, attribute the core disturbance of the illness to a higher cognitive process, such as theory of mind or meta-representation. In contrast, phenomenological approaches locate the main disorder in schizophrenia on a lower level, regarding it as a fundamental disturbance of the embodied self or a disembodiment. And this includes a weakening of the basic pre-reflective sense of self, also called ipseity, a disruption of implicit bodily functioning, and third, a disconnection from the intercorporeality with others. And as a result of this disembodiment, the pre-reflective practical immersion of the self in the world is fundamentally disturbed. This basic alteration develops gradually, often many years before the manifest acute psychosis. According to the concept of that is mainly developed by Joseph Parnas and Louis Sass, Stangelini and others, schizophrenia involves a diminishment of basic self-awareness, which is also can also be described as a lack of vital contact with reality. It is experienced as an existential feeling of lacking presence, of being alien to the world. This permeates all areas of experience. To give an example, a feeling of total emptiness frequently overwhelms me, as if I had ceased to exist. Another patient describes it as follows. It is as if I'm not a part of this world. I have a strange ghostly feeling as if I was from another planet. I'm almost non-existent. Second, the disturbance includes a disembodiment of action. The disturbance of basic self-awareness is accompanied by a loss of the habitual bodily functioning that normally mediates our relation to the world. Patients often experience a disintegration of habits and bodily practices. So instead of simply dressing, walking, driving, etc., they experience a disautomation. They have to prepare and to produce each single action deliberately, which leads to an hyper-reflective awareness of normally tacit functions. For example, if I want to do something like drinking water, I must go through it in detail, find a glass, go over there, switch on the tap, fill up the glass, drink. At times I could do nothing without thinking about it. I couldn't perform any movement without having to think how I would do it. So we see that here the implicit habits of the body break down and must be replaced by conscious planning and execution. This leads to a loss of spontaneity, to increasing self-observation, to hyper-reflexivity. every action requires targeted attention and a special action of the will. It is not for nothing that the patients often speak of a break between themselves and their body. They feel hollowed out, or they feel like lifeless robots. I'm like a robot which someone else can use, but not me. I know what has to be done, but cannot do it. In perception, then, the disembodiment manifests itself in an impaired capacity to recognize familiar patterns, familiar shapes, familiar Gestalten. And this in turn leads to an overload of details. For example, I have to put things together in my head. I look at my watch. If I look at my watch, I see the watch strap, face, hands, and so on. And then I have got to put them together to get it into one piece. Everything I see is in bits. You put the picture up bit by bit into your head. If I move, there's a next picture that I have to put together again. And finally, the third domain is the disembodiment of intercorporeality. I forgot that. There's also an alienation of perception that may still go on, where the subject becomes, as so to speak, the perceiver of his own perceptions. He witnesses his own perceptions like from the outside. And this alienation of perception is expressed, for example, as follows. I become aware of my eye watching an object. I saw everything I did like a film camera, like in a subjective camera shot, so to speak. And another patient described it even as follows. For me, it was as if my eyes were cameras and my brain would still be in my body, but somehow as if my head were enormous, the size of a universe, and I was in the far back, and the cameras were at the very front. So I was extremely far away from the, so things were extremely far away from the cameras. As you see, this disembodiment even reaches to domains where we normally perceive ourselves in the world, and now patients perceive the world from the inside of their head, so to speak. And the disembodiment goes on in the sphere of intercorporeality. It is the lived body that mediates the practical knowledge of how to interact with others, as we have seen above, as we have seen before. So the lived body mediates our understanding of the other's expressions on the background of the shared situation, and we are involved in a sphere of primary intercorporeality. But in schizophrenia, this involvement in the world is disturbed, and again results in a fundamental alienation. Patients report that they feel isolated and detached, unable to grasp the everyday shared meanings of the world. People have a system, a patient complains. I try to understand it, but then I don't understand anything. When I was a child, I already used to watch others to see what was the moment to be happy or to be sad. I've studied a system to intervene at the right moment in conversations. Or I'm like an emperor in his pyramid. I'm not involved in the world, merely observing it from outside to understand its secret workings. And thus the behavior of others comes to be observed from a distant, from a third person point of view, and patients are no longer able of entering embodied interactions with others. To conclude, sorry, I dropped this. To conclude, schizophrenia implies a disembodiment of the self in the sense of losing one's habitual bodily performance, and with it as a disturbance of the patient's lived space and relationships with others. So schizophrenia shows us through its fundamental disturbance the normally mediating function of the lived body. or the embodiment of subjectivity. I started with the statement that mental illness is not a malfunctioning process occurring in the brain, but a disturbed way of bodily being in the world. So mental illness in general is an extended phenomenon taking place in space and time, in particular in between the patient and the others. The patient is ill means that his world is ill. I've taken the example of schizophrenia, which may be considered as a disturbance of the patient's lived body, lived space, and intercorporeality with others. Certainly, disturbed neuronal maturation in early life plays a major role in the development of schizophrenia in biological terms. But nevertheless, there are no brain systems that produce the illness by themselves. Mental disorders are not mere diseases of the brain. They are always disturbances of a patient's being in the world and being with others. And to conclude the whole talk, I started with a thesis that the significance of phenomenology today lies not only in being a science of consciousness. Rather, it is the phenomenology of the pre-reflective, lived body, of our embodied subjectivity, that is able to challenge current mainstream paradigms in cognitive neuroscience, in social cognition, and also in psychiatry. These paradigms are based on a disembodied and functionalist concept of the mind as a system of algorithms produced by the brain. The paradigm change that we are witnessing today re-embeds the mind in the process of life and thus in the world. The phenomenology of our bodily being in the world corresponds to the ecology of the living organism as it is conceived by the paradigm of embodied cognition. In other words, the lived body mediates our relation to the world, and it is the counterpart of the living body, the organism, which enacts its world. And both aspects of the life process complement each other. I've then chosen schizophrenia as the paradigm case for an extended and ecological concept of mental disorders. But it may still serve another purpose. The disembodied, detached experience of schizophrenic patients resembles, in many respects, the disembodied representationalist concepts of mainstream cognitive science and mainstream social cognition. I remind you of Thomas Metzinger's quotation at the beginning. First, our brains generate a world simulation so perfect that we do not recognize it as an image in our minds. Then they generate an inner image of ourselves as a whole. We are not in direct contact with outside reality or with ourselves. We live our conscious lives in the ego tunnel. And somewhat pointedly, one could say, if we were all schizophrenic, then Thomas Metzinger would be right. We would then feel a split between ourselves and our body, which we would have to steer from the outside, like a Cartesian ego. We would not inhabit the world through the medium of our body, but we would feel distant to the world, not really present, like on a foreign planet, as many schizophrenic patients describe it. And if Metzinger was right, we wouldn't empathically understand others, but we would have to theorize about them in order to make sense of their puzzling behavior. We would indeed live our lives in the ego tunnel. But this is fortunately not the case. Fortunately, we are no movies produced by a brain, but we are embodied living beings. Fortunately, we do not live in a matrix world in our heads, but in a life world that we share with each other. And the significance of phenomenology today may be seen in helping us to recognize our human condition again and to understand it in a new and in a deeper way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thomas, thank you very much for your very rich and extremely interesting lecture. I'm just wondering why we were not stopped by Zoom, so we are continuing our meeting. So that's a good news.
For some reason, okay, that was fine.
Yeah. So thank you very much once again, and colleagues, please, your questions, comments. I think we have 10 minutes. 10 or 15 minutes
time left. Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
So please.
Can I?
Yes, Michael, please. Yeah.
Professor Fuchs, thank you very much for the very, very interesting talk. The question I want to ask is the next one. Like, what do you think of the fact that what you have described as psychological diseases often takes place and even becomes like methodological procedure in the classical, like, for example, Husserlian phenomenology, like the idea of disinterested spectator, spectating itself as interacting with the world in the intentional acts, like the reduction which suspends the world, the idea of transcendental consciousness, which is not part of the world, the problematization of the world and what is taken for granted, etc. So that's my question. What do you think of it?
Okay, so your question is how transcendental phenomenology relates to these experiences of schizophrenic patients. Is that?
Yeah, in part it is. But what do you think of the fact that what you have described as this kind of disorder can become the part of philosophical like program?
Yeah.
Not to take the world for granted and so on.
Yes. Okay.
Can
well,
it be like, yeah?
This parallel, this parallel between many schizophrenic experiences and the central and crucial method of phenomenology has been detected by phenomenological psychopathologists as well. For example, by Wolfgang Blankenburg. And he described the epoche, so the phenomenological method of bracketing the world belief, as in some ways similar to the lack of the embedding in the world, so lack of being embedded in the world that schizophrenic patients experience. So this alienation, this derealization that many patients describe, in some way resembles not being in the world as a matter of course, and thus is in a way the phenomenological method of epoche. But on the other hand, we may not, of course, we may not confuse both experiences. What the phenomenologist does certainly brackets the experience of the world, but he does so in a theoretical manner for methodological reasons. And he becomes not alienated from his body through this. He becomes not alienated from the world in the sense of living in a kind of matrix world, living in a world that becomes completely alien to him. But his bracketing of the natural belief, of the natural attitude, is something that is only done deliberately and methodologically. So there is certainly a crucial difference between taking this phenomenological stance of the epoche and in this way going back to a transcendental consciousness on the one hand, and on the other hand, the forced derealization of the schizophrenic patient who cannot choose between both attitudes, between the phenomenological attitude and the natural attitude. So that would be the crucial difference. But there are indeed some similarities here. You're right.
So I have also a small question concerning this remark made by Thomas Metzingen about the ego tunnel. I'm just wondering, does Metzingen know something about passive constitution? So because, so you know, of course, that the sphere of passive unconscious doesn't merely represent a psychic phenomenon. It is not the repressed as it was considered by classical psychoanalysis. So the sphere of passivity is inseparable from the bodily life of the subject. So moreover, it permits every consciousness activity of the subject through the bodily executions. And this topic of corporeality, which represents the fundamental structure of subjectivity, is, so I should say, so wide new. And here we can, of course, criticize the theory of pure subjectivity and draw our attention to the fact that the genesis of subjectivity is of the bodily nature. But all these thoughts we can find in later Husserl's manuscripts and in Merleau-Ponty also. So, so my question just, I wonder, does Metzingen know something about this?
No, Metzinger, you're completely right. Metzinger doesn't know very much about phenomenology. He takes a metaphysically realist view and starts with the assumption that all there is what natural science tells us. So all that there is basically physical objects, and one special physical objects, namely the brain, is able to create inner models of the world. But these inner models are certainly not the actual reality, and therefore it makes no sense for him to describe and to analyze these consciousness structures. So therefore he doesn't care for it. His whole approach is a completely different one, namely starting from physicalist reality. And you're completely right. The analysis, Husserl's analysis of passive constitution would come very near to embodied accounts, because it precisely describes how our lived experience is built up, is constituted by basic, including bodily syntheses, so by forms of passive synthesis that form our full awareness of the world. But this is not just produced by itself, but it is a complicated structure of building up conscious awareness through passive synthesis. And this could be parallel. This could be put in parallel to many descriptions and research results in cognitive neuroscience. The only presupposition is that you take not just the brain, but the whole body in contact with the environment as the basis. Husserl did a lot in his analysis of space and object to describe the interdependency of our sensory motor bodily awareness with the structures that we perceive in space. And this is precisely an embodied account that Metzinger could find in Husserl, but he doesn't know him. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's true. Some more questions, please, or comments, colleagues, please. Students? Yes, we have. Okay.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and I have just a very naive question that's dedicated. Why you just chose schizophrenia as a particular one disorder, and why you don't took any other disorder? Because I think that it is like that embodiment can be separated and not exclusive for this understanding body and body disorder. Because, for example, think about impulsive compulsive disorder and something like this. Why you particularly think of schizophrenia? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, one first reason is certainly that there was just a possibility of giving one example of a major psychiatric disorder that may be seen from an embodied point of view. And I've done a lot of work on other major psychiatric disorders and described them from such a view. So it's just a reason of a limited space, of course, or limited time. But on the other hand, schizophrenia is particularly well suited to illustrate such an embodied approach, because it is precisely showing through the experience of disembodiment that the patients describe how our normal embodied life functions, how we normally are in the world and perceiving and acting in the world, feeling the other as connected to ourselves. All this can become illustrated, can be illustrated and can be even analyzed in more depth if we have the so to speak, the counterexample of schizophrenia, in which all these embodied processes, or the major embodied processes, get lost, and a disembodiment results that ex negativo, so to speak, can illustrate and can show us what our normal embodied awareness of the world enables us to do, how our body enables us to be in the world. So that's the example I chose for this reason. I think in schizophrenia, more than in other disorders such as depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, this fundamental lack of embodiment precisely illustrates what normal embodiment means. I hope I have made it a bit clear.
May I ask a question? Thank you for your lecture. You mentioned the role that phenomenology has to defend, for example, our knowledge against reductionism. But I would like to know, do you think that phenomenology could have other functions of resistance? For example, in the critique of ideology, when we have an aggressive, so to say, message, could phenomenology here play this role of defending or resisting? What do you think on this matter?
Well, this is a role that phenomenology increasingly has realized in the last, well, maybe in the last decade. And there is also a kind of political phenomenology being that has started to be proposed and to be developed in major, in major articles and books. So political phenomenology would be the attempt to describe the basic attitudes, so to speak, the attitudes and the Einstellungen that make us perceive the world, also the social world, in a certain sense and in a certain respect. So if we follow political and, for example, ideological worldviews down to their constitutive moments, so to speak, how they are constituted, how they are constructed, then I think phenomenology can have a critical task. So this critical task would be different from the critical task which I mentioned today, so the critique of reductionism. And here, phenomenology would have another critical role, no less important, certainly, but which I didn't mention today, the critical role of analyzing the constitution of ideological worldviews through its constitutive elements. That's a very general remark, of course, but I just wanted to express my agreement with your view that phenomenology can have certainly a political dimension.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas, once again, that you have accepted our invitation, and
thank you
very much for this lecture.
You're welcome, all.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think perhaps we can meet each other one more during this year. We will be very happy for this opportunity.
I could repeat a lecture in if we have another online occasion for that, and you could choose between different topics that might be well, that was a very general overview today. One might choose a more specific topic which I could talk about. It's fine with me. So you just can address me another time the next month.
Okay, then we keep in touch. I will write you. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All the best to you all.
All the best to you also. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Коллеги, я верно понимаю, что я не отключаю сейчас
запись. Давайте приостановим запись.
Включаем.